within the dorsal striatum itself, the recontextualizing of the trigger, seeing it in some new light, really changes how your dorsal striatum processes it. Instead of going down the greased skids of the fast path to whatever the badness is, now you can actually chart out a new habit to form. So you have to replace the old automated, efficient habit with a new habit that involves the same trigger. But that's what you need reframing for.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at optimwork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at optimwork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work Podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be back with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, Kevin. Well, last week we talked about addiction and the 7 deadly sins and trying to understand that more ancient concept in light of recent developments in neuroscience and psychiatry, and how do these new modern fields look at those concepts. And I thought here we could also kind of follow up on that and talk about what happens as an addiction develops. Like, how does it start? How does it develop? How does it continue? And what's the difference in the structure of the addiction, as it's deepening, as it's developing? What's going on there? Because I think that'll also give us some insights into how to reverse it and what that process looks like.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I guess to start, Kevin, I mean, when we're talking about the 7 deadly sins or any addiction, it seems like it starts out in a kind of deliberate way, like we're seeking some pleasure, some good, but then as it develops, it becomes more of an automatic habit. So maybe the first thing is just, how does that happen?
Yeah, and I think that it's always great just to, every time you talk about addiction, unlike any other topic in all of medicine, you have to give a definition of what do you mean by addiction, which is funny because it's the only, Bruce Alexander is a famous addiction researcher, and he said, no other field does this. You always have to define addiction when you're talking about it. The definition I like, just to repeat, is that it's any repeated behavior in which you violate you violate your ideals because of cravings. And even better than cravings is to say because of compulsion. So any repeated behavior that leads you to violate your ideals out of compulsion. That is a great description of addiction. And the compulsion aspect is crucial. And there is in psychiatry a difference between what we consider impulsivity and compulsivity. And broadly speaking, impulsivity is seeking pleasure. And so people just vary in how impulsive they are. Some people are just more impulsive. But compulsivity is an avoidance of a particular pain. And that's where you get the loss of freedom. That's the hallmark of addiction, is that somehow this has become a way of avoiding pain and this is true of every, you could say avoidant habit, I could say bad habit. I don't want to sound judgy by saying bad habit. But you think of what are called the 7 deadly sins, which is certainly a more judgy way of saying it. Each of them has this idea that it became compulsive. So lust or gluttony or greed, envy. These are things that may have started out with a certain kind of pleasure that the person took delight in, but quickly then, and the reason these are the 7 deadly sins is because these are where people are most likely to experience a shift from something being impulsive, pleasure-oriented, to actually being compulsive and taking away freedom. That's why they're deadly. That's why they're like a kind of slavery.
So, Kevin, what's happening in the brain when this shift actually occurs?
Yeah, that's an exciting thing that's come to light recently, which is the importance of this shift, and that you can actually see it happen on an fMRI machine. So if you take someone who is early in an addiction, We don't study the 7 deadly sins, but we do study addiction. And so that's where we have all the data. So it could be, say a person is addicted to cocaine. Okay, well, the first times they're using it, right before they would actually use it, what you would see, once the craving has been triggered, you would see a highlight, like an activity increasing in what's called the ventral striatum. The striatum is just a striped area in the brain that we saw when we were dissecting brains, because it's alternating layers of gray matter and white matter. But it's in a very important place. When I was in med school, we were taught that the purpose of the striatum is just to control motor movements. But now we know it has this huge role to play in motivation and emotion and cognition. So beyond just motor things. But basically, when the ventral striatum lights up, a person is thinking of the pleasure they'll get and focused on that. And so they have a certain prediction of the pleasure that will come. That's what lights up the ventral striatum, the prediction of pleasure. But with repeated use, and then they get into a certain pattern of using, unfortunately, with that repeated use, you can get this shifting to what's called the dorsal striatum. The dorsal striatum basically responds to, its whole goal is to automate behavior and make them more efficient. As a consequence, it makes them more rigid and perhaps insensitive to the impact it makes on your life. So this is called the dorsal shift. So as the real addiction sets in, the moment that the person now is compulsively using the drug, what's happened in their brain is the dorsal shift has happened for that habit. So you go from the impulsive, pleasure-oriented use to a compulsive use, which that stage is dominated more by cravings. And so the dorsal shift happens then. It's especially responsive to cravings and the relief that you get from certain behaviors that help you to avoid those cravings or make them stop. So the dorsal striatum is where freedom goes to die, to put it. It's where the deliberation goes, where doing things just because you enjoy them. They may not be good in themselves, but once you get the dorsal shift, now it becomes compulsive. It becomes less and less about the pleasure. And we've known that for a long time. And it's even not so much about even the emotional experience of the craving. It's just that when there's a cue, which is a stimulus, you are going to have an automated sequence of responses, each response being like the stimulus for the next response. So there's this daisy chaining of responses that people experience as a tunnel vision, that leads to them doing the thing. So not everyone who does something addictive actually gets addicted to it. So the real sense that when addiction sets in is that now is not about the ventral striatum, it's shifted upwards. Dorsal striatum is actually right above the ventral striatum, and it shifts upwards, and now the behavior takes place without any reference to outcomes, which is why people can lose so much from addictions. And I should also say things like OCD, which is the exact same process. The compulsions in OCD are entirely coming from the dorsal striatum. So in these things, once that sets in, the behavior is unrelated to outcomes and the impact it makes on your life. It's just that once the stimulus is triggered, it's going to go step by step by step in a kind of mastery that has happened. So it's an important concept, the dorsal shift.
Yeah. So this thing seems key, that you're no longer doing the behavior to seek a reward, but you're just doing it as a kind of stimulus response, like you've conditioned yourself to just do this thing. So that seems like maybe it was something that could have been known for a long time in psychology, but now we're discovering what the neuroscience behind that is. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And so we've it's been now some decades where we've had rat models, because everything I've said about cocaine addiction, I was actually thinking of rats. So because this is like the standard thing you get rats addicted to. And if you damage the dorsal striatum or do things that block its activity, in fact, you don't see the same compulsive use. So it's interesting. But you also don't have other healthy habit formation. So the dorsal striatum is, you use it all the time. If you can walk elegantly across a room, that elegant movement is because your dorsal striatum has been perfecting, making more and more fluid and efficient all of those movements. So if you play the piano, your dorsal striatum was there. It's because you probably, in your own training, Sharif, have experienced that you learned how to play things in a certain sequence. And if something interrupts it, you lose the whole thing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So in fact, all habit involves the dorsal striatum. What makes addiction different is because not every habit is compulsive, right? It's when it gets linked to the alleviation of pain or discomfort. When it's driven by dynorphins, that's when the compulsion then really sets in. And the reason this is so important is it's actually the dorsal striatum that is the biggest source of dynorphins in the entire brain. The vast majority of dynorphin comes from the dorsal striatum. We normally automate and make things more speedy or efficient, the things that we have to do to avoid discomfort and threats. So our whole system is designed to make threat processing and avoidance of discomfort more automated. What happens with addictions is that the whole machinery gets hijacked. And because the cravings or even just the emotions that trigger the whole sequence, like loneliness we were talking about last time, it could be any emotion, negative emotion. All of those things then create this emotional urgency to avoid the bad thing, and that's what triggers the dorsal striatum then to go into overdrive.
So earlier you said the dorsal striatum was connected to, earlier, just now, the dorsal striatum is connected to the release of dynorphins. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
So that seems to imply that since the dorsal striatum is involved in every habit, that every habit involves dynorphins to some degree, or there's some involvement there.
Oh, so not everything that the dorsal striatum does involves dynorphins, but everything that has to do with the unwillingness to experience a discomfort, that's a special case that the dorsal striatum handles, where it releases dynorphins. You get this aversive feeling, and you're much more likely then to go into a dorsal striatal habit loop, where that's the stimulus. So the stimulus for these compulsive habits is always dynorphin mediated.
I see. Okay, so these habit loops in the dorsal striatum have triggers.
Yeah.
And dynorphins can be one of these triggers.
Exactly. And not to be too technical, but like the ventral striatum is, at that point, it's just about like the endorphins people get from enjoyable things. They get some dopamine and endorphins. And so that's not aversive at all. So the ventral striatum is more about the things that you willingly do, even though it may be impulsively. But the dorsal striatum gets more and more involved when now there's a high unwillingness to go without something. That somehow that thing has become important to avoiding discomfort, which is why every addiction is always serving some avoidant mechanism. There's always some underlying thing that the person is unwilling to suffer, and that makes them far more likely to engage then in compulsive behaviors.
You said that every habit involves this dorsal shift, and the dorsal shift, I guess you would say it seems like the main characteristic is that now the behavior becomes automatic, like it's stimulus response. You just kind of do it.
Yeah, and efficient and increasingly rigid.
Rigid. Okay.
So it's hard to interrupt it. Like a piano, like even on a piano, it gets hard to interrupt things.
Yeah. But sometimes we talk about habit or good habits, virtues, as being more liberating. I mean,
Exactly.
You're free, you're doing it deliberately. So does that mean that these good habits where we're acting deliberately do not have a dorsal shift going on? Or, help me to understand that.
Probably there are elements of, like one of the skills that I learned, in residency training is to stay calm when someone's screaming at you. So now if someone screams at me, I can stay calm. Is that a habit? Probably, right? And so there probably is a little bit there where it just happens automatically. I stay calm. But the thing is, when when it's not done compulsively, when it's not done in the service of avoiding pain or the service of unwillingness, these habits can stay flexible and deployable, and they're just one with how you want to be acting, and they fit into higher ideals. So when we have higher ideals that are motivating us, there's an enjoyment we get from that. There's actually, virtue is its own reward. And that reward is partly involving what's called our ventral striatum, which is how you handle rewards. So even good things like virtues, would keep our ventral striatum kind of online and involved. Because these virtues don't involve an overwhelming discomfort if we resist them. So when people have a compulsion, it could be like washing their hands after touching something contaminated. That's the OCD thing. So, that hand washing it's very painful to resist doing it the first time. And so it tends to just be very automated. But the good news about talking about, if you see signs in yourself of the dorsal shift that are related to these bad habits, that means now we have some tools we can use this understanding to help us to get over the bad habit. Because I think this is fundamentally very optimistic. Because we know a lot now about what it takes when your dorsal striatum, actually what you see, I'll just say, with serious addictions, the dorsal striatum stays chronically hyperactivated, which is it's an interesting finding. It's always there. And you see these in people who, the moment they wake up in the morning, they have a huge drive to drink. Right. And so it's like their entire waking day is dominated. Those people, if you put them in an fMRI machine, it's all the highlighted activity of the dorsal striatum. And so it gets completely disconnected from the prefrontal cortex, which is where we think about long-term things and ideals and morals. And so it's just completely disconnected from them. Once the dorsal striatum gets into this kind of the habit loop, now you have automaticity, you have efficiency, you have rigidity, and you also have total insensitivity to outcomes. So it could be the loss of grace, the loss of money, the loss of relationships. It's completely insensitive to those things. What do you do to restore it put it back in the rest of the brain, to reconnect it with the other parts? And there are really good answers to that.
Cool. Well, Kevin, I want to get into those.
Okay, good. I don't know if you have any question before we get into the answers. Yeah.
I do. I just a couple. Good. Well, so one is I'm wondering if this new understanding of the neuroscience. I often hear a lot. Well, it takes how long does it take to develop a habit? 28 days, whatever is what people say, or a month. So I'm wondering just if this understanding of a habit at the level of the brain now gives us a way to watch a habit develop over time to see the shift happening from in the brain, and then we can measure how long that takes. And I bet it depends also on age of the person, but I don't know if there's any insight into that. Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support.
We'll probably have to, people can do it on their own. If you've never used Instagram, then, or say X or YouTube. Okay, so the first times people use it is completely ventral striatum mediated. So because you enjoy something, you look for something you're interested in, you watch it, all of that. What's interesting, even when it's just about enjoyment, the person is still sensitive to outcomes. So in that phase, people are actually really not as likely to violate their morals, because that involves insensitivity to outcomes. That's the dorsal shift, or that's one of the things that happens when you have a dorsal shift for this whole behavior. So, but then it does happen that as people get more used to using, say, X or YouTube or Instagram, There's the phenomenon of doom scrolling. Yeah, and people can spend long periods of time and it can cut away into their sleep, cut away into their relationships or their prayer life. So the doom scrolling is a real thing, right? And that is completely the result of the dorsal shift. So now it's become compulsive. That in some way they go into a tunnel once they're on YouTube or whatever the thing is. And in that tunnel, then they have automaticity and efficiency and rigidity and increasingly insensitivity to outcomes. And it's that last one that really makes it the vice. So I think that when people can learn to detect these little habits and how they form, there are some things where it forms really quickly. And partly I think it has to do with what is the pain it's allowing us to avoid. And that's why these things are never just about the craving, because we wouldn't have gotten into the situation if we weren't looking for something as an escape from some other pain, because these are all kind of ways of escaping or self-sabotaging. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this whole shift reminds me of a comparison that you introduced to me, I don't know, several years ago probably, but the idea of an addiction being like going, riding a bike downhill, down a mountainside. And initially you choose to go down because it's I'm going to go fast. It's going to be really fun. Yeah. But then after a period of time, you start to lose control, and you're just going downhill at the rate that the mountain, at the rate of the steepness of the mountain. So it seems kind of like that. Like we're getting to the neuroscience of going downhill at a dangerous speed.
Yeah, and what you're talking about there is the idea of momentum, and behavioral momentum is entirely a dorsal striatal phenomenon. And what we mean by momentum, for the negative habits, for the vicious cycles, what we mean by that is the increase in automation and speed or efficiency and rigidity, where it's harder to change course. That's momentum. And so it's easy for any of us, to see, say you're watching your favorite show on, Netflix or whatever. At the end, you want to watch another. There's a kind of momentum to keep going. So, and that leads people to binge. Or you're eating your favorite cookie, and then there's momentum just to keep going and keep going. So behavioral momentum is just a sign of the dorsal striatum being involved. I think this is different than what are called virtuous cycles, which are entirely in your upper cortex. They do make use of these lower things because, you're going to be moving elegantly while doing virtues. You're going to be using all your mastery, and a lot of the components of implicit mastery involve your dorsal striatum. So there's plenty of good uses for it. But the real increase in meaning and mastery and enjoyment, that's a higher thing. And it doesn't involve these tight habit loops that you see in the dorsal striatum.
Yeah. Well, great, Kevin. Maybe now we could go into how do we break these things, these dorsal loops?
So you can summarize the entire field of treating addiction, and particularly as it relates to the dorsal striatum in 3 words: reframing, mindfulness, and challenge. You knew it. So, and of these, this is where actually all the research is. So, and there's a lot of research showing that in fact, each of those things changes the relationship of the dorsal striatum to the prefrontal cortex and lets the connections get restored. Because you have, in a serious addiction or OCD or other anxiety disorders, you have a real disconnection between the habit loop machinery of the dorsal striatum and the prefrontal cortex, where you have your morals and identity. So people do things that violate their identity and violate their morals, right? So these things need to be practiced ideally, any time in the day is good, but especially right at the moment that you have detected a stimulus, a trigger, a cue. So you can tell that, somehow you can tell that ideally you can be aware of the craving. So you can be, now here's the craving that will do it. The cue could be paraphernalia. It could be a situation. It could be a person. It could be an emotion. Whatever it is, as soon as you detect that, that's the moment to practice reframing. If you reframe the challenge as an opportunity to grow, that new context for the stimulus unplugs momentarily your dorsal striatum. So now you can think about it more flexibly. And that's why, so reframing has to be the beginning.
Yeah. So let me just give you a kind of a hypothesis, and then you tell me if I'm way off or not. But it seems like, so you have these, dorsal loops, habit loops, where given a trigger, you're going to respond in a particular way, and it's almost automatic. And to break the addiction, you have to break that loop, that connection between the trigger and the response. So, but if all you do is avoid the trigger, you're not reprogramming the addiction. And that might be why people have relapses after, say like an alcoholic who avoids, who gives up alcohol for years and years and years, but then somehow they just enter a situation that maybe triggers the response, but it was because they had only been avoiding the triggers before, but hadn't actually reprogrammed the dorsal loop. Is that way off? Or
I think that's entirely right. And so avoidance strategies can never reprogram your dorsal striatum. So, and they can never reconnect it to the prefrontal cortex. All right. So like when people are struggling with viewing pornography, there is a role that things like filters play, but filters are fundamentally an avoidance strategy. So I think filters are great for preventing accidental, exposure to unwanted things. But pure avoidance strategies do not reprogram anything about within your dorsal striatum or how it relates to your prefrontal cortex. So they do not address the issue that you have a powerful circuit now in your dorsal striatum that is insensitive to outcomes. That's so crucial. So, but reframing actually does do a work of changing the relationship between the dorsal striatum and your prefrontal cortex, which can inhibit that whole behavioral sequence. And also, within the dorsal striatum itself, the recontextualizing of the trigger, seeing it in some new light, really changes how your dorsal striatum processes it. So again, instead of going down the greased skids of the fast path to whatever the badness is, now you can actually chart out a new habit to form. So you have to replace the old automated, efficient habit with a new habit that involves the same trigger. But that's what you need reframing for. So it's not just like, I'll never be lonely again, and then I'll never have to, handle my relationship with drinking, to use that example from last time. Well, no, it's like, no, when you're lonely, how do you handle it in a new way? How could it bring out your best response? That question pauses the dorsal striatum and the habit loop. Now you can start to think in new ways so that when loneliness is detected, you can more willingly engage it. But willingness then actually starts to re-engage your ventral striatum. And so you get out of the dorsal shift. The other thing that's interesting is that, because you can do this in a scanner, there's evidence that mindfulness itself, just this active, non-judgmental awareness of the present, particularly of any urges you have, and so craving and urge, I think of them as basically the same thing, and that's the same as the idea of a compulsion, but it's just this strong compulsive urge to do something. That's the hallmark of the dorsal shift. Mindfulness reverses the dorsal shift directly and allows your ventral striatum to be back in charge with your prefrontal cortex. The ventral striatum is more connected to the prefrontal cortex. That doesn't go away in addiction, because we're all built to have long-term goals also speak to our reward center. So the more you can think of long-term goals and the growth you want to attain and the bonds that you want to be developing, all of that is the work of reframing, which gets things set up in a new way. But then mindfulness just solidifies it. It's like it adds gravity to undo that dorsal shift. So it's a powerful treatment.
Wonderful. Hey, Kevin, well, we're almost out of time here, but I wonder if you could just briefly explain how challenge fits in, because we kind of floated reframing, mindfulness, challenge, and we've talked about the first two.
Yeah. So the essence of challenge is to do something in a new and better way. And there's an approach to working with addiction. There's a book called Do One Thing Different. And it's one of those books where the entire book is contained in the title. So that's the whole book. The power of just do one thing different. And it's by Bill Hanlon. And the idea is that if you can insert a new behavior, which is doing something in a new way, that's a challenge. Just insert a new behavior right at the beginning of the habit loop, as soon as you notice the stimulus. Well, reframing actually and mindfulness are both new behaviors that you can do at that beginning. So they already count as doing one thing different. But even if it's something like step outside briefly, drink some water, snap a rubber band on your wrist, put on a tie, whatever that new behavior is, it can undo the entire habit loop. Which is interesting, is that it just goes to show that these habit loops get to be so rigid that rigidity is actually their vulnerability. Because if you can just do something unexpected and new, it won't engage that habit circuit anymore. So I think it's interesting, but I would of course be wanting people to instead think about practicing those skills of reframing and mindfulness and challenge for a set. It could be a set amount of time. It could be just make sure you do 3 golden hours a day. So I think that the golden hour is actually the best general maintenance treatment to help people never get stuck in the dorsal shift.
I love it, Kevin. And I think for people who want to practice golden hours, it's great to go to optimwork.com. We make it so easy and so fruitful for people to be doing golden hours in their work.
That's right. And we have a new and more powerful reframer that we keep updating, and that will walk people through these very steps. So any habit you want to break, you mention it, it'll ask you for what's the stimulus, like when does it happen? So you can identify the pain, be more willing to embrace it, identify the skills, that's the challenge. But actually, it's a very powerful new tool.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Kevin.
All right, Sharif, thank you.
All right, we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out optimwork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.